Now I want to go ahead and talk about some games. So we have some of the well-known ones that I could have talked about, like Daxter, Secret Agent Clank, the God of War games, Final Fantasy Tactics, as well as Crisis Core, Metal Gear Acid, and Peace Walker. But instead what I wanted to do is compile to about 20 games in total, 5 of them being PSP Minis, which are a whole other thing that we could make an entire video on talking about PSP Minis and the cool history of those. Essentially, they were sort of like the PSP's version of DSiWare, where they were smaller games for the most part. Not always, though, because one of the PSP Minis we'll be talking about was actually pretty huge, like a full-length FPS game, so we'll be talking about that. But then I also had 15 other games. Just, these aren't like, oh, the best-selling or, highest rated PSP games of all time. These are just like 15 random games that I came up with, where it was just sort of like, if I thought about it, I wrote it down, and I wanted to put a bit of variety on here. We have some RPGs, tactical RPGs, racing games, collectathons, some platformers, some fighting games, some shooters, a horror game even. So, we have a lot of variety here. So this will give you a good idea as to just like, rather than the typical top 10 or top 20 list, like, oh, get this game and this game, and everybody's just saying Final Fantasy, God of War, it's just like the same thing over and over again. These aren't the most niche or underrated games in the world, and this isn't even like, oh, like a complete list of every game I'd recommend. These are just some games I'd recommend, and if you're looking for more recommendations, I have played hundreds of PSP games over the years, and I'd be happy to recommend more to you in the comments if you would be looking for more recommendations. As I mentioned before, we have 20 games to go through, so we're not going to linger on just one for too long. I'll try to throw up some trailers on the screen if I'm able to find some that aren't copyright, have a bunch of copyright tied to them on YouTube. There's a few in here that were published by EA, and EA was a little stingy about that in the 2000s, so I'll have to be careful there, but first up, we have Spider-Man 3, and this one is really impressive because essentially the PSP version of Spider-Man 3 is the same that we got on the PS2 and the Wii. Not the same as the PS3 and 360. It's a whole thing. This was that era where you would have one game called the same thing, except there was 5 different versions of that same game on different platforms. You had the DS version of Spider-Man 3, you had the PS2, Wii, and PSP version of Spider-Man 3, and then the next gen, at the time, version of Spider-Man 3, whole thing there. But basically, the one on the PSP is the same as the one on the PS2 and Wii, which is really impressive because it is a fully open world Spider-Man game. You can swing around the city, fight crime. You can either go through the linear story missions, or you can just swing through the city like you would have back on, like, Spider-Man 2 on the PS2, where you'll come across different crime activities you can take care of, civilians to save, and just do the Spider-Man thing, not to mention the fact that you can also use the black suit in this game, and this is the fully uncompromised Spider-Man 3 experience. The full story is here, all the cutscenes, everything like that. Seeing it back in the day blew my mind, and to this day, it still blows my mind, because it is very impressive seeing this game in action. Next up, we have The Godfather Mob Wars. Unfortunately, I cannot include a trailer for this game, because every time that I try to include gameplay of this game, it ends up, EA does the thing, and they end up copyright striking me, but I'd recommend going up and looking up some gameplay or a trailer for this game, because it is really impressive and it's pretty cool. So this is The Godfather Mob Wars. Forget if I said that already or not. But essentially, the Godfather game on consoles, on like Wii, PS2, Xbox 360, and all that, was an open world GTA type of game that took place during the events of the first Godfather movie. And, it's one of my favorite games of all time because it takes a lot of the major scenes and events from the Godfather movie, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, and it lets you, your main character, which isn't actually a character from The Godfather, it's a custom character that you create, and it's sort of like this fanfic version of The Godfather while also staying true to the movie, and it lets you play through all the main events in this open world GTA type game. Obviously, even though the PSP could handle a game like Spider-Man 3, which was still open world, The Godfather, just because of how much there was to that open world, I assume it was just a little too much for what the PSP could handle at the time, considering the fact that the game was released for the PS3 and 360 and managed to make it onto the PS2 and the Wii. However, we got a very comparable version on the PSP, which combined not only the open world-ish and action elements of the game, so you have all the main story plot beats that you would have played through in the main console version, like the moments where you're carrying the horse and putting it in the dude's bed, he wakes up screaming, it's like, sees the bloody horse head there. That's there. All the final assassinations at the end of the game, those are all there. Don't worry, that's not a spoiler because it doesn't actually tell you, like, what main people you're going to be assassinating. I mean, it's a Godfather Mafia game. There's going to be assassinating. Don't worry, I didn't spoil anything for you just there. But all of the main plot beats from the Godfather game and movie and such that you would have seen on the flagship version of the game are all here and accounted for. And then there's the Mob Wars aspect out of it, which basically turns it into like a card game, semi-RPG, tactical strategy game. It is so out there, and it's like, at first you'd be like, okay, how does this card game tie in with like an open world GTA type game? It works, and it works so well. You're gonna be like It basically goes, you do a mission and then you do some management. You do a mission and then you do some management. And sometimes you might need to do some extra management. And during that management, there's also parts where there's going to be like gameplay intertwined with that. So say you're like, okay, so basically the whole thing of it, right, is getting as much territory as possible and taking over as much of NYC as possible. So then your family is like the head family. So sometimes, say, to take over some territory, you're going to need to take over certain businesses. So rather than just, you know, it being a constant thing of, okay, you do a story mission, then you do the card stuff, story mission, card stuff, sometimes there's mini side missions inside of the card stuff. So you're still getting gameplay while doing the whole Mob Wars card game type of thing. And to, you know, sometimes to capture territory, you'll need to raid certain warehouses and bases, or you need to take over certain businesses. So you launch those missions, and rather than having all of the territory taking over bits take place during the card game, you can actually play out those segments. So you initiate the attack, you go in, it goes to actual gameplay, you know, you're in the car, you get out, you go in, you interrogate or vandalize the business that you gotta vandalize, you get the money, you get your guaranteed paycheck, and then that's that. And then, you know, you go back out to the car, escape the police, escape the gangs, whoever you gotta do. And the territory is yours, and then it moves you on to the next step of the card game. You play your cards until you can't no more, then it sends you on to the next story mission. Hopefully that all makes sense as I was explaining it, but it is a very addictive cycle, and it stays very true to the original game and story, and it is absolutely fantastic. One of my favorite and most played PSP games. I return to this one often. It is a fantastic version of the Godfather game, and I highly recommend it, whether or not you've played the main flagship version before. We still have 18 games to go through, so I'm going to try to pick up the pace. I don't want to linger on just one game for too long. That one I just wanted to explain a bit more since I couldn't provide any trailer footage. Next up, we have Lego Batman, which is literally the exact same as the flagship version that you would have gotten on the PS2, Xbox 360, PS3, Wii. There is some Lego games where on, you know, the PSP or the PS Vita or the 3DS, it's going to be more of a paperback handheld experience, but this is one of the few Lego games that is just a complete one-to-one port of the console game, so I highly recommend this. Lego Batman is one of my top 5 favorite games of all time, so you already know I had to put it there. I always have it on my PSP, you know, one of my most played games, not only in general, but also on my PSP. Absolutely adore Lego Batman, of course. Such a fantastic video game. Next up, we have Split Second, and let me tell you something about Split Second. This is an underrated racing game. Now, obviously, this game was mainly just released for the Xbox 360 and the PS3 and all that. However, there was a very impressive PSP port released of the game, and it is pretty faithful. Obviously, it's a bit pared back in some of the content, some of the graphics and stuff like that, you know, mainly with the resolution and stuff, but for the most part, it is an uncompromised experience. You're still gonna have that lightning fast, arcadey racing, you're still gonna be bringing down cranes and buildings and setting off explosions to mess up the other people that you're racing against. It is an absolutely fantastic game. It is quite the showcase for the PSP. It is so much fun, and I cannot recommend it enough. And even if you don't plan to buy a PSP, at least get it on your PS3 or 360. It is such a good game, so much fun, and it's also backwards compatible on the Xbox One and Series X and S, so that's another pathway there. Next up, I wanted to go ahead and recommend Ghost Rider, which is essentially like God of War, except Ghost Rider. This game was also available on like the PS2 and such, where it's essentially the same thing. However, the PSP version is a bit different. So the PS2 is a bit more of like a linear story type game, whereas on the PSP it's more of like a level based. Go in, kill 25 guys, there you go, that's the level. And it's very addictive, you know, with that pick up and play handheld nature. There's also a lot of other cool missions from the console game here, where, you know, you're gonna be like riding the motorcycle, fighting certain bosses and stuff. I don't want to spoil too much about the game, but it is a lot of fun and the combat is very satisfying. There's some brutal finishers in this game, and I cannot recommend it enough. Again, it's sort of like a God of War clone, but it is absolutely fantastic. Next up, I wanted to go ahead and talk about Marvel Ultimate Alliance. If you haven't played Ultimate Alliance before, I mean, I don't even know what you're doing at this point, but obviously we've had 3 games in the series at this point, Marvel Ultimate Alliance 1 and 2, and then 3, which is unfortunately still just exclusive to the Switch, hoping it can get released on more consoles at some point so more people can experience it, but nonetheless, we have Ultimate Alliance 1 here on the PSP, and it is a one-to-one version of the game that you got on all the other consoles, which released on PS3, 360, Wii, PS2, and a bunch of other systems under the sun. This game translates beautifully to the PlayStation Portable just because, you know, I feel like the PlayStation Portable has always been one of the perfect systems when it comes to RPGs. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the aesthetic of the system, the controls of the system, just, I don't know, the vibes of the PSP, right? There's something about RPGs I just feel at home on the PSP. and Marvel Ultimate Alliance. Obviously, it's a bit of an RPG, leans more into the action side of things, but still an RPG at its core. So absolutely perfect for the PSP. Cannot recommend getting the game there enough. Next up, I wanted to go ahead and talk about Jeon d'Arc. I don't know if that's actually how you're supposed to pronounce it, but we'll just go with it. This is a tactical RPG, a super underrated one at that. It is worth mentioning that if you have a PS4 or PS5, it is also available now through their PS Plus premium service, and you can also just, buy it outright if you want to do it that way. That just released a few months ago. But we're talking about the PSP specifically, and obviously the game is absolutely fantastic on the PSP. It's the way that I played it for the first time years ago. There's a good bit to chew through here. I believe my first playthrough took me a little over like 30 hours back in the day, somewhere around there. It was around like the 25 to 30-ish hour mark, but yeah, it's an absolutely fantastic game, and I cannot recommend it enough. It does not get talked about enough, and I want to sit here and just gush about this game, but I truly do believe that it's one of those games where the less that you know about it going into it, the better. Just know that if you like tactical RPGs, if you love great characters, and if you're looking for a story that lasts for a decent amount of time, again, going for about 30 hours or so, but something that's not too long at the same time, like maybe like 100 to 200 hours or anything like that, but again, a good story you can really get invested in, that'll definitely pull in your heartstrings at multiple points. I highly recommend Jeon d'Arc, and again, if you have a PS5 or PS4, you can also play the game that way. Next up, I wanted to go ahead and recommend Toy Story 3. Now, the version on the PSP is the same as you would have gotten on like the PS2, for example. It's one of those games where, and this is something that you'll see a lot as you start digging into the PSP library, where there was a lot of games that either released on PSP first and then went to PS2, or they were on the PS2 first, then they went to PSP, or, the PSP and PS2 versions were just developed simultaneously since they were so comparable hardware-wise, or at least what they can handle video game wise. And I mean, it's Toy Story 3, right? It's a 3D collectathon platformer based on the Toy Story 3 movie. An absolutely fantastic game, very charming. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the, fun toy box or sandbox mode that a lot of people gush about in the 360 and PS3 version, which is a lot of fun, of course, but again, we're talking about the PSP specifically here. So I would highly recommend getting the PSP version of Toy Story 3. This is another one that was also made available a little while ago on PS4 and PS5, but having a full-scale licensed tie-in experience like this on the PSP is just, I don't know, it's so heartwarming, it's so nostalgic, and obviously I have a lot of nostalgia for Toy Story and Toy Story 3, so it's just one of those things when you're playing the game on the system, all cuddled up in bed, blasting through Toy Story 3, it's a lot of fun. Very nostalgic, very charming, highly recommend that one. Next up, Call of Duty Roads to Victory. This is Call of Duty on the PSP. It's based on Call of Duty 3, and I mean, it works really well. When you look at the system and you see the fact that there's only like one analog stick, you might be like, all right, how's a first-person shooter gonna work on here? But it actually works surprisingly well, and I got through the game with literally no issue. Next up, I wanted to talk about one of my favorite PSP games. It's up there. It's hard for me to pick a favorite PSP game, but it's within the top 10, if not the top 5. Super Stardust Portable. I love these Stardust games. Doesn't matter if we're talking about Delta, Portable, literally any of the Stardust games. If you're unfamiliar with the Stardust games, essentially these are twin stick shooters, which I know it's not really twin stick because we're talking about a PSP here, but you're the spaceship shooting rocks, flying around a planet, occasionally taking on bosses. It's very arcadey. That's all I can really say about it. Don't go into this expecting some 100-hour long RPG with in-depth characters and such. No, you're going into this because you want a fun, turn your brain off arcadey experience. And that is exactly what this game will offer. If you want to go for high scores and grind the game for dozens of hours, you can do that. If you want to blast through the campaign and beat the game in an hour, you can do that too. Just do whatever you want with it. Just have fun. That's all I'll say. That's all that the game is about. Just having fun, that arcadey experience, and I love it. Next up, I wanted to talk about Dragon Ball Z Shin Budokai, which is literally just the Budokai games, but on the PSP. Not Budokai Tenkaichi, but rather Budokai, which were the 2D versions. Well, technically, Budokai Tenkaichi and Budokai were both in, 3D, but, Budokai was more of like a 2D style fighter, even though there was 3D elements, whereas Budokai Tenkaichi was all about like the 3D action, but I mean, if you've played a Budokai game before, you know what you're getting yourself into. It's that, but on the PSP. It's fantastic. It has a fully original story mode here as well. Well, as original as you're going to get from a Dragon Ball Z game, still follows the events of, some of the arcs in Dragon Ball Z, as you would expect. So this is another one that I obviously highly recommend. Being able to have a Dragon Ball game in your pocket, I mean, having Kamehamehas and special beam cannons on the go. I mean, yes. Next up, I wanted to talk about GTA Liberty City and Vice City stories. These games are very impressive. They are full 3D Grand Theft Auto games akin to what you would have seen with GTA Vice City, GTA 3, San Andreas, or whatever, on the PSP. I'm not kidding. Full open worlds, GTA games, full story modes, side missions, cop chases, the whole shebang. It's literally just full GTA games on the go. I don't know how Rockstar managed to do it. They are wizards, but it's very impressive. It was so impressive, in fact, that these games ended up getting ported to the PS2. Yes, these were games that went from the PSP to the PS2. They were that impressive, so highly recommend this. And there's also Chinatown Wars if you want a bit of a different GTA experience on the go. That game was also on the DS as well, and I always felt like that game was, you know, the DS was always kind of like Chinatown Wars' home, but it's great on the PSP as well, obviously. Next up, I don't want to linger on this one for too long since we already talked about a game sort of similar before, but this one was still so notable that I had to mention it. Dante's Inferno. Yes, the PS3 and 360 game, once again, on the PSP. Don't know how they did it. Absolute wizards. Similar to Ghost Rider, as we mentioned before, you know, it's going to be like your God of War type of game. Square, square, square. Sometimes throw in some triangles if you want to spice things up a little bit. Crazy bosses, crazy locales, full story mode, whole shebang, cutscenes, everything like that. It is very impressive seeing this game run on the PSP. No idea how they managed to do it, but I'd highly recommend that one if you want a full-on 7th gen console game on the go. Next up, I wanted to go ahead and recommend Monster Hunter Freedom, which is a portable version of Monster Hunter G, which is an enhanced version of the first game. So there's also Monster Hunter Freedom Unite, which is basically the exact same thing, except that has multiplayer elements. But again, we're talking about the PSP here, so you're probably just gonna be playing this solo anyway. But I mean, if you want to have like the overall, I guess, most recent up-to-date version, then you could go with Unite. But you know, I'd just say go for Freedom. I'm not sure what I can say about this game that hasn't already been said before. I mean, it's absolutely mind-blowing seeing it run on the system, and it's Monster Hunter. I mean, who doesn't love Monster Hunter? You're hunting a massive beast, getting materials from said beasts in order to make yourself more powerful against certain other beasts, and then you can go hunt those beasts. You just progress through the story, and yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's Monster Hunter on the go, and it's awesome. And finally, we have Silent Hill Origins. Well, I shouldn't say finally, because we have more PSP minis to go through then after this list, but anyway, Silent Hill Origins. Obviously, this game was also available on other platforms, but I mean, having a full-on Silent Hill game on the PSP, that is impressive. And plus, you know, once you get the headphones going, you know, you turn the lights out, you lay in bed, you're playing the game, oh my goodness. It works. It really does. Not to mention the fact that Silent Hill Origins has some killer atmosphere. That's one of them games where, you know, it's probably not gonna completely scare your socks off and give you, like, full-on PTSD from playing it. But, I mean, you know, it'll still give you the heebie-jeebies, especially if you got a good pair of surround sounds or, you know, headphones going. Yeah, man, it's a great game. And finally, I wanted to talk about some PSP minis, since, you know, similar to the DS, as I mentioned before, you know, where that had, like, DSiWare and such, where it's like, okay, it's a different library of games, you might as well mention them. PSP Mini, same thing. It's sort of like games, but, you know, they're like smaller scale games or ports of mobile games, as you guys are gonna see here. There's a lot of mobile games here. But first things first, I wanted to go ahead and talk about the Terminator PSP minigame. This is a top-down twin-stick shooter, and it's a lot of fun. I will say towards the end of the game, it's not necessarily challenging, but it does take a bit of patience. Like, you know, it's not frustrating by any means. It's just one of those things where if you try to go in running and gunning it just nonstop, you're gonna get your butt handed to you. So make sure you respect the game and take your time and you'll do just fine. But yeah, this game's absolutely awesome. Had a lot of fun with it. You can beat it in like an hour or two, but yeah, it's fantastic. So much fun. Very arcadey, but a lot of fun. Next up, we got Nova, which is Halo on the PSP. Well, you know, it's not actually Halo, but you know, it's basically like Halo. You're seeing the gameplay on your screen. You know, it's one of those Gameloft games where it's trying to be a certain franchise in everything but name and switching things up enough to not get hit with some sort of like copyright strike or, you know, getting taken to court for one reason or another. But yeah, I've always absolutely loved the Nova series as somebody that has a lot of nostalgia for that App Store era where we were getting a lot of games like this that were trying to be full-on console experiences on the go in your pocket on like your iPod Touch or your iPad or one thing or another. And this is one of those games that again was actually released for mobile initially, but then made its way over to the PSP via PSP Minis, with it being a first-person shooter on the system, as you can expect. Since there's not a second analog stick, you are going to be using the face bumps to look around and all that, and then the, you know, the two shoulder buttons to shoot and aim and all that, but it works very well on the system. I didn't have any troubles beating the game on the normal difficulty, and, I mean, the Nova series is honestly great. There was 2 other games after this. They never ended up making it to the PSP, but you can find ROMs for the second one, I'm sure, somewhere online if you want to play it on your Android or whatever. And then as for the third one, I believe the third one is actually still readily available in the App Store, so, you know, you can just go ahead and get that one there as well. But if not, I'm sure you can find a ROM for that out there somewhere as well. The sequels are great, though. Next, I wanted to mention Angry Birds. I mean, if you want to see gameplay, then here you go. I mean, there's some gameplay of Angry Birds on the PSP. It's Angry Birds running on the PSP. That's not me trying to dunk on the game, by the way, because obviously I love Angry Birds. I mentioned it because I love Angry Birds, and to this day I play Angry Birds constantly. It's just that, I mean, it's Angry Birds. Everybody's played Angry Birds, right? Next up, do you want Geometry Dash, but on the go? Well, I'm sorry, you're not gonna get that, but this is pretty close, and it was actually the original Geometry Dash before Geometry Dash stole the idea. So this is the Impossible game, and you know, I feel like most people ended up playing this through like the Xbox 360 arcade games back in the day. At least that's how I did it. I forget if it was through arcade or indie. It was one of those. It was one of those Microsoft services. But yeah, you know, even though that's the way that I played the game for the first time, when I realized that it was available through PSP Minis, I got it immediately, and yeah, it's the exact same game. It's still just as rage-inducing. I still suck at it. For some reason, I'm like halfway kind of okay at Geometry Dash. I can get through like the first 7-8 levels in the game. After that, just forget it though. Like demon levels, I can't even get through the first 1%. But for some reason, the Impossible game has always just been even more difficult for me. So again, it's available there. Just be prepared to, I don't know. I mean, again though, if you're buying a PSP, I don't know if one of the first games you want to play is a game that's going to make you want to smash the device, but you know, it's just a recommendation. And finally, if you've ever heard me talk about the PS Vita, you've definitely heard me talk about this final game, that being Age of Zombies. This is a twin stick shooter, and I have raved about this game for the longest time. It was available on mobile, PS Vita, PC, and PSP. The way that I play the game typically is on PS Vita, but you know, it's here on the PSP, so I figured I just had to mention it as well, because it is one of my favorite twin stick shooters of all time. I absolutely adore Age of Zombies. There's so much charm in this game, so much personality, so much character, so many laughs. No matter how many times I play the game, I still constantly laugh at all the gags and jokes and references. It's surprisingly mature. You're playing as the main man, Barry Steak Fries, trying to stop the zombie apocalypse and traveling through time, and it is just absolutely insane. I love the game so much. Again, I've gushed about this game time after time again, so here I am doing my due diligence and gushing about Age of Zombies for the 174th time. But anyway, that is a handful of games that hopefully you can find at least a handful of those to buy at a retro game store, buy on eBay or Mercari, or acquire through other means.